So it's my great pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Lisette Van Doorn, who Lisette is CEO of ULI. And I want to by the way, all the speakers and panelists brochures are available in the online brochure for the seminar. So I won't just read everybody's profile, mercifully. But Lisette is a particular, can I call you a catch here, Lisette? Because I know you've been very busy at MIPIM, where you've been in the very heart of our industry, where all our investment people are coming together. So it'll be interesting to hear what the latest news is among those leaders of our industry. But also, of course, you are a leader yourself, and you've over the several years, you've done some amazing things. And now with the ULI, particularly with the zooming in on the S of ESG report, it's foundational to what we're going to talk about today. So with no more ado, let me invite you to take the floor and tell us how ULI and how you yourself view the fundaments of the S in ESG, which will be a very good starting point for our day's discussion. Lisette.
Thank you so much, Steve. Well, thank you, Francois and Günther, also for the invitation to speak. I really appreciate it. This topic is of huge interest to our members, and otherwise we would not have covered it. What I'll do is talk through a couple of slides, and then if there are any questions, happy to answer them either via the chat or any other way. And don't hesitate to reach out to me if you have any questions later on. I think I can share the screen. Yeah, this is looking good. Well, we did, over the past couple of years, this has become, Francois just raised the point, would we have discussed this a few years ago? What we have seen in the last few years is already an increasing concern across the industry on social issues. Many of you might be aware of the annual report we do with PwC, Emerging Trends in Real Estate. And besides the business issues and the business sentiment, we also ask questions about social and political issues. And what we've seen is gradually increasing the concern around housing affordability, probably not surprising, and social inequality. And at some point that triggered us. So we spent a special chapter, that's what we normally have, in the report to look more in detail on it. Where is the industry? What is happening? How do people view it? Why do they do something with it? And so on. And that kind of led to a discussion more on we need to do more on this topic, and also understanding where it sort of comes from. Because obviously it's part, and many of you have already referred to that, it's part of the bigger ESG focus that we see. And what is driving that focus? And actually it's all of us individuals. And I would say especially the younger among us who even have a stronger urge implicitly in where they want to work, how they consume, etc., and how they save their money. First of all, we are all consumers, getting much more conscious, sometimes driven by an environmental concern about where are the goods coming from? How sustainable is the company operating where I buy the goods from? And being much more vocal about that. Those same people work somewhere, well, many of them, the adults, and getting more and more conscious about what type of business is it? Is it not just focused on financial profit, but also looking after its employees, looking after its footprint and the wider society, and getting more selective in that? And then obviously many of those employees save for pensions. And therefore also institutional investors are confronted with questions about, great, that financial return, but what else do you contribute? And how do we ensure that that financial return doesn't come at the cost of the social capital, as Francois just mentioned it? And I think that's a very important consideration, because the big absent here is regulation. And I'll come back to that later. And I think that is very, very important to realize. We see a huge push in real estate from the institutional investor side and the consumer, the tenant side. And I think that's really important. So all of this led to us coming to the conclusion we need to understand this better. And we scoped it. We decided to do a project zooming in on the ESG, very kindly supported by a number of corporate members of ULI you see on the screen here. And we scoped it in a very wide sense, because we had not seen, there was not a lot of comparable material already done. So we said, let's just look at what does social value mean for real estate? What is already happening? How can you structure this? And what can you do? So that's basically what we did. Well, first on to why we asked, part of the project was to do a survey. We combined a survey with interviews, with roundtable discussion. So this is a very practical overview, basically, on what's already happening and what's people's views. It was mostly focused on Europe, but we have included also some global examples. And so why does it mostly matter for companies? And most of it, the biggest proportion talks about demonstrating a positive contribution to society. But whether it's alarming or not, it's also talking about beneficial for the company's reputation and part of strategy. So, and don't forget the importance for attracting talent, also following my previous comments, for attracting and retaining talent. And then required, almost half also think it's required by clients, shareholders, and customers, and that's what we see a lot. What is really at the bottom of the list is the financial benefit. And I'll come back to that later, and the same is risk mitigation, which I personally found quite surprising, but we can talk about that later as well. And then we asked people, okay, what is needed for the industry to move forward on this? And then, probably not surprising, but way out stood the comment about better ability to measure social value outcomes. I think it's important to realize almost the bigger picture in the industry, and the real estate industry might not be the only one. But if we go back a couple of decades, maybe the industrialization after the war, many companies developed their businesses, and the examples still exist. Look at Volkswagen in Wolfsburg, who sponsors a football club, etc. There was that realization more that if you did well also to your employees, maybe were involved in educating their children, and that eventually led to additional value in the company. We've become an industry which it's a financial asset, but which has become completely focused on measurement. We first need to measure to justify the investment. The bigger picture on this is a good thing for the long term, and it will create long-term value, is very hard to argue without data. And the other thing I would say, and we'll talk about that more as well, the industry has gone to full splintering almost of the different elements in terms of development, planning, investment. And what we'll see later is that focus throughout the value chain on social value, if you want to properly create it and make it a benefit for society, as well as from an investment perspective, needs almost that integrated point of view. The other big thing that people talked about was leadership within my organization. What we've seen a lot is that we've seen impact investing products come. It's almost similar to how the focus on environmental sustainability began, where we had green funds. And if you had the name green in the title of your fund, it already had a premium. Now it's unthinkable that you don't have an integrated point of view and a strategy in every due diligence, in every asset due diligence, corporate, etc., on environmental. And I think therefore we're moving sort of in a transition to that. How we end up with this, but ultimately we need to get to an integrated approach to social value creation. And that is also where the leadership point comes in. Needs to come out, start at the top and filter through. Now it sometimes seems more of an operational or a product marketing approach. Okay, let me move on. How do we define social value? Because that's quite interesting. There's not one definition. So we defined it as something that's good for society. It's actually already a very old concept. I think Schumpeter in 1905 or something first talked about social value. And it was for the benefit of society versus the benefit of the individual. Culture and values underpin social value creation, being civic-minded. In real estate, we see a huge focus on ESG. But that's more the internal company focus. It's the E, the S, and the G. While ultimately, we need to widen the perspective to the society. And then you start approaching this more from the UN SDGs, who talk about society. And then you see how you fit into that as a real estate company. Enhancing the prospects and well-being of places and people. And it's globalization versus localization. We've seen the industry, real estate industry, become global, hugely international. If you want to create social value, you have to operate on a micro local level because there's not one size fits all. You will need to work on a place by place basis. That's also the complicated matter, and that it also differs heavily from an environmental focus. This needs a case by case approach. Every time working with local organizations, non-profit, etc., to find out what is needed here and how can we contribute that. A while ago, I had a conversation with a private equity manager in the UK who said, I've really identified, also interested to add social value. I've identified a real opportunity with youth centers because years ago, they've all been, they all disappeared because of cost savings from the government side, but we need to bring them back. The only thing what I want is I want to work with one organization who's going to manage them all locally. That is the hardest part because it just doesn't exist. And even if it exists, you need those local people. So this is sometimes difficult for real estate companies who operate on a global level, try to have a standardized approach, and then need to add that local flavor to it. Just quickly, and I've already talked a bit about it, it's how this is I took from INREF, who've developed a framework where we see social value basically covering the whole spectrum, where impact investing sits more in just one area. And there's a wide range almost to how financial and social return interact. Where almost at the left side, it's almost exclusively about financial returns. And the more you move to an impact investing approach, the more variation you get in both are evenly important to sometimes, and then you already move to the philanthropy side, where social return is more important than the financial return. Obviously, ultimately, it's also a question about how do you measure that financial return? Talking a bit about social value creation in real estate. And then it's very important to understand that value chain, because social value in real estate is different when you look at the development versus the investment management perspective. In the planning and development phase, if you talk about social value creation, it's all about the use of land. How am I going to use that land? What uses do I put onto it? How dense do I make it? What social infrastructure do we put on, for example? While later on, from the management side and the operational side, it's much more of the use of the property. How do you use that property? And that is fundamentally different. And what it actually is that in the planning and development phase, you put in the fundamentals to create and maintain that social value in the later phases. Hence also my earlier comment on long-term perspective. To put it in and to do it well, you would already like to have, talking in money, the long-term investor involved at the start. And then it's not only does the social value come from, but also there are different stakeholders and different factors to consider in each of those phases. And probably the biggest challenge, how do you marry the two? Because a lot of the fundamentals that you may have put in, more green space, more affordable housing, a school, well, you name it, may not be valued at the transaction level by the investor who kind of has the right fundamentals to create that social value. And that is often a big issue we see, because in the development phase, it's much more about also using local employment, using underrepresented groups in the development, help educate. So it is much more related to the real development. Later on, it's much more about community building, working with how does it impact, how can you improve the education of the community. It's the affordability aspect. And I think those two elements are very important to keep in mind. Interestingly, we looked at, there's a big difference to where social value is now and how it's been used to where we were with environmental implementation, say 15 years ago, what I just spoke about. At that time, there was no way to measure environmental impact. So we started with BREEAM, LEED, subsequently GRESB came, and frameworks were developed along the way. That's not the case with social value. There are already a huge amount of principles, frameworks, tools, and you name it. So it's more of the question of finding the right tools and frameworks than trying to develop new ones, and it's still happening. So what we try to do is provide a framework, analyzing all those different frames. I think we analyzed over 100 of those frameworks, analyzing those and helping to put a overall framework together with different phases, how to build a strategy, remember the leadership importance. So it's first all about defining goals and objectives. What are we trying to do? And then it's aligning the KPIs and metrics with those initial goals. Then it's all about measuring, managing, and reporting. What we heard a lot is, yes, we're reporting on it, but are you then also feeding that back into the organization, creating that loop for continuous improvement? Well, not really, don't know really how to do that. So that KPI may be more a reporting KPI than someone on how can we make it better. And then there's also important, it's the exiting of the investment. how do we ensure that that value creation approach you put in place is not disappearing at the moment that you sell it? And that is, I think, still a topic where there's a lot of debate. Looking a bit more in detail, where kind of what are the different elements to consider when you are kind of in each of the phases. When defining the principles and approaches, we see a lot of use of the IFC's operating principles, the IMP's set of norms, UNAP Impact, UK GBC Social Value Guide, and often a lot is still also local. When it's about defining goals and objectives, it's more about the UN SDGs. Some companies also use the OECD well-being framework, local plans. It's about local needs analysis, stakeholder engagement tools, and bespoke databases, for example. And then aligning those KPIs and metrics, it's about social value databases. And interestingly, you also see almost a division in the industry, whether you measure social impact in a monetary value or whether it's much more qualitative approach. And there's no agreement with that. And obviously there you also see the certification element, although that's also almost the jungle in itself, what to use when and what added value does it provide. We're actually doing a project now together with INREF and UNEP-FI to map all kinds of building certifications, portfolio reporting requirements, both regulatory and voluntary, along the E, the S, and the G, because it's become almost an issue to know when to use what, and it's become so overcrowded that it's almost not useful anymore, but people may disagree with that. And then it's about the measuring, the managing, and the reporting. It's, do you follow up on the initial, for example, local needs analysis to see how it's been experienced by residents, audit of process, audit of results. And then, as I mentioned before, the exiting of the investment. How do you almost fully integrate that social value creation element? A couple of quick examples, because I may run out of time. King's Cross in London, where interestingly, it's been a huge development, and some of the key success factors have been that public space around it, but also with a university academy being one of the main first tenants who basically attracted many of the commercial tenants as well. It's really finding that balance. We have another example in Belgium. It's called ECLA, St. Jans Molenbeek. Molenbeek you may remember because it's one of the most deprived neighborhoods in Belgium, where at the time of the terrorist attacks, that's where the terrorists were living. This is a project of Revive, who came in almost as the first developer to help improve the neighborhood. And what they did, already before starting development during the planning and permitting stage, was placemaking, hiring artists to already make it a place where people wanted to come to, and a community engagement approach. They built a lot of social housing, a lot of social infrastructure as well. And they have, for one of the buildings, they have an agreement with, it's either the Brussels municipality or the state to rent that out for 25 years, who then take basically the master lease, and it's for social housing. And that is a really interesting example where you combine different income levels. It's very high quality public space, and you still can make a financial return from it. The Reinventing Paris program that many of you may be familiar with is a very interesting example as well. And although it may already seem quite old because it started in the financial crisis, it was Paris's response to how can we stimulate development in a time of financial crisis, especially in the real estate industry. And what they did is found locations, the easy accessible ones, where either the city had ownership or they could quickly mobilize regeneration, and issued tenders for each of those different plots. And it was not about the highest bid. It was about quality for the environment, either both for the future tenants, future residents, as well as for the wider city. So it was really evaluated. Every project was evaluated on what do you bring to the city. And I think that's a very important approach. It also shows the partnership approach between the city and the private sector, which is absolutely key. And the project in Montreal, C40 Demain, my French is not so good, by Ivanhoe Cambridge, is actually a follow-up project to that, because after Reinventing Paris, C40 took on the collaboration and issued similar processes in many different cities, like Montreal. Milan, I think, also participates in that. And then a project in Copenhagen, which is called UN 17 Village by NRAP, a Danish manager developer, where they try to apply all the 17 UN Sustainable Development goals in all the different aspects. I think it's under construction now, so it's not fully operational, but it's very interesting how they've thought about mobility, urban farming, community building, and all of that. And that's what we also see. It's very important to share experience and best practice, but it's very much under development at the moment. So I'll end with a couple of recommendations that we also derived from the whole exercise we did for the report. Ultimately, it's about place-based strategies. There needs to be a strategy for a location. And in theory, hopefully in practice too, it is the local government who is actually should be best placed to come up with that. Real estate is a hugely fragmented industry. Even the biggest owners own only a very small percentage of total stock in any given city. So ultimately, for it to work, it needs to have a broader perspective than just a couple of buildings that may be owned by one owner. And that's why we think that local place-based strategy led by the government is very important. I've already talked a lot about corporate leadership to ensure an integrated approach to social value. It's absolutely key. And then it's about transparency, accountability, and data. It's not just data for reporting, it's data to evaluate what's been done, what went well, what can be done better. It's not about more data, because often what you see is huge number of KPIs where data is collected on, but they're not actually knowing what to do with that. So it's be selective, but make sure it's integrated. And then it's about innovation. We need new thinking, we need new approaches. Measuring financial return is one of the key elements in that, I think, because the current year-on-year total return approach is not going to help us. Often social value requires investment in the short term, as I've also showed with that value chain approach. The value comes over the long term. How do we redefine those returns? How do we better measure the risks so we can better come up with the risk-adjusted return? And that is a key element, because often social value helps to reduce the risk of the investment, hence the risk-adjusted return. Education and training. We need to bring the industry, both public and private sector, on board. And it's about collaboration. It's not either public or private sector that can achieve social impact, it's the combination of both. And that is easier said than done, as we know, because it all starts with trust. But starting small is not a problem. Start somewhere on a concrete project, learn from that, share the learnings, and move on. I'll stop talking now. Thank you very much for the opportunity to share this, and happy to take any questions.
Lisette, thank you so much. What a great start to the day you've given us, and your messages about collaboration, for which ULI is an impressive example of collaboration, bringing people together. You just make some excellent points. You make too many points. You've given us a whole bunch of new things to talk about today. And I'm just going to pick up one thing from your report. You're absolutely right when you say our real estate industry, particularly the investment side, has had a bad rap. It's got negative connotations where we are thought of as people who are just creating economic wealth for ourselves, when in fact, as this seminar shows, we are just falling over ourselves to try and constrain our economic focus in favor of a more socially focused risk reward message, and talks, presentations like you've just given us are absolutely key when people listen to these things and start thinking about what we need to do differently. And we're making a little bit of progress, and we need more. So that's my way of saying thanks so much for joining us in such a busy week and giving us such a fundamentally and well thought out message from the ULI viewpoint. Okay, we're going to go into the panel discussion led by Dr. Paul Kennedy. I hope Paul is on here. Yes, I see him. Thank you, Paul. This is an interesting panel, and again, we're grateful to you all for joining us. We have three practitioners: Paul himself, who's the MD of JP Morgan Asset Management, based in UK. We have Colette Timming from Chicago, who's the Chief Strategy and Product Officer for Blue Sky IBE, which is incidentally talking about diversity, woman-owned business, business enterprise, WBE, and she's one of the leaders there. And Louise Brooke-Smith, Lou and I go back a long way with RICS. She was the first lady president of RICS and made some remarkable inroads into projects that a lot of people had not dared go to, including some development in sub-Saharan Africa. So Lou, it's wonderful that you can join us. And then our academic is Hao Liang from Singapore, whose resume, if you read it, is incredibly impressive. I feel so dumb now when I look at what you've done. So between the four of you, led by Paul, I hope you're going to respond to some of the things that Lisette has talked about and come up with some insights from your own experience. So over to you, Paul.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Steve. It's a pleasure to be on this to be leading this panel, and to be here with with some friends old and some friends hopefully new. I mean, I've been involved with the European Real Estate Society for about the last 30 years, and it's good that you're taking a look into this area. I think Lisette's presentation was, as ever, excellent, and threw out so many questions that I think we're going to try and get stuck into over the next 50 or so minutes. I mean, for myself, the definitional questions really sort of resonate. What is it? How do we measure it? Importantly, as an investment manager, how do I balance social and financial? Should I sacrifice financial return for a social contribution? Is that what my clients want? One point, I think it came over the end of Lisette's talk, what I find really interesting. Does the push into ESG change the definition of what core real estate is? Does it change our thinking about obsolescence, about how we protect protect value, how we maximize value for our investors, even if we are looking at this through just a financial lens? I think it almost certainly does change the robustness of cash flows. There's an obsolescence link, so it links into so many interesting areas of our subject matter. One of the things that really sprung to mind as well as an additional complexity. Lisette shared the example of King's Cross. And one of the challenges that was reported on that development was that some of these social goals are not necessarily internally consistent. So there was a push towards greater security, which then conflicted with privacy requirements. So I think there are so many topics, but thankfully, we have a great panel, as Steve outlined. Not only do the panel CVs speak for themselves, but also we come at the topic from I think 4 very different and hopefully complementary perspectives. Louise, I'll let the individual panelists introduce themselves in a second, but Louise coming at this from a planning and development perspective, as well as with her ICS background. Colette more from a corporate real estate perspective, and obviously Hal coming in as not a real estate specialist, as he's at pains to point out, but so as a real estate, as an ESG specialist, offering something that may jolt us out of our real estate specific focus. So just very, very quickly before I hand over to my colleagues who can introduce themselves. I mean, as Steve said, my name's Paul Kennedy. I'm a managing director and head of strategy and a portfolio manager with JP Morgan Asset Management. I've been managing global real estate portfolios around the world for the last 25, 30 years, and trying to operate at the intersection of investment management and indeed academia. So hopefully the 4 of us, with those 4 different perspectives, will be able to unlock some of the questions. So I think ladies first, obviously. So Louise, would you mind giving a brief introduction to yourself, and then also your initial response to Lisette's presentation?
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Paul, and to Steve for initial remarks, and particularly to Lisette, who's set the scene and set the bar very high. As you've intimated, I'm a chartered surveyor with the RICS badge, but I'm also a chartered town planner. And I think that there will be quite a number of people who know of the RTPI and the work that it does. I've got about 40 years experience across the public and private sectors, both in the UK, but also internationally. And as Steve mentioned, quite a lot of experience across sub-Saharan Africa. My background is very much planning and development. I had established and grew a national planning practice in the UK. We did work internationally, and then my exit was selling that to Arcadis, which is an incredibly large corporate multi-D consultancy. When I joined Arcadis, I not only took that planning mantle with me, but I also took up the mantle of head of social value. I've been involved in social value for some time. I'm not going to say it was easy trying to get the idea of social value across all the colleagues at Arcadis, because there was, and there has been, I think until recently, quite a difficult mindset to get across. Most people saw social value as green fluffy charity days. That was, somebody had to define it. That was it. It isn't. And it took some time to be able to get the idea of additionality, which is what social value can be defined as, across the piece in terms of property development and real estate. So that was quite an interesting challenge. I actually left Arcadis to take up a number of non-exec roles, which I'm going to pull into some of the discussions that we have later. And one of them that I'm going to pick up on and give it a good example, because I think it puts some meat on the bones of value, of measuring social value. I sit on the board of the Land Trust, which is, I will go into it later, but we've got some very good examples of where development the impact of development in terms of social and environmental value can be measured. But also with the PLCs that I'm on the board of, social value is becoming incredibly important. So just going back to some of the points very briefly from Lizette's presentation, I do like the idea of an integrated view. I know that we will talk about collaboration later on at some point during the day, but also I've picked up on the point of leadership, a bit like diversity and inclusion and sustainability. They're entrenched now, and if they're not entrenched in what people do, how they operate, then they damn well should be. But it's got to be led from the top. And so ESG and the social value element has to be led from the top of any organisation. And I think once it is led from the top, it then becomes second nature. So that's one of the areas that I was very pleased to hear Lisette mention. But just very briefly talking about planning, because that's one of my hats. One of the biggest shocking figures is a piece of work that was done recently with the National Social Value Task Force and the planning organisations in the UK. They came up with a figure, and I'm going to read the figure, of 30 billion sterling of social value that remains unfulfilled across the UK in terms of the development that's taking place and some of the additionality. I call it that because I think that you can picture the additional value over and on top of normal development process that's just sitting there and is not being captured. And there's a lot of work that's taking place now. Government is sort of on board, let's put it that way, but with COP26, with the real push, I know we'll talk about impact of COVID, but with the real push to embrace this into design, into land use management, I think that now is such a good opportunity to get social value entrenched. It's not an add-on, it's entrenched. So that's my takeaway from Lizette's opening remarks. You're on mute.
I was muted. Yes, someone had to say that.
Yeah.
May as well be the first. Colette, please, why don't you give a brief introduction and then your takeaways from Lisette.
Thanks, Paul. So I'm honored to be here as probably one of the few practitioners also on the user end of the corporate real estate. So when we talk about collaboration, just having a seat at the table with some of the individuals that develop the real estate that I work with clients to either occupy or manage that space. So opening in that dialogue, my background, I'll just say it stems a few decades. I grew up on the corporate real estate side with companies like Boeing and Oracle. I had the pleasure of joining the service provider side, leading FM globally for Cushman & Wakefield. Also had the honor of being a chief administrative officer of a public company. And now I have the pleasure of co-founding a firm that really focuses on ESG, helping clients through this journey, in addition to facilities management. So takeaways, Lisette did an eloquent job of talking about the S. I think that the key here is the collaboration, what's happening. And I also think it's financially in the business case. And I know we're going to talk about that in more detail later.
Great, thank you. So how would you, as our non-real estate person, could you come at it from that broader perspective, please?
Okay, thank you, Paul. It's a great opportunity for me to be here. I'm Hao from Singapore, and as Paul mentioned, I'm not from real estate side. I'm more from ESG side. So I'm now an associate professor of finance at Singapore Management University. I'm also sitting on the management committee of a newly launched Singapore Green Finance Center here. And at my school, I teach sustainable finance, private equity, and my own research also falls into these areas. corporate social responsibility, impact investing, and some traditional corporate finance, corporate governance topics. So this is a little bit about me, and I think one major comment I want to have on Lizette's presentation, and that is also related to what I'm doing with the Singapore Green Finance Center, although it's called Green Finance, giving people an impression it's about E, but we do focus on S as well. It's about how to measure social value or how to measure the stakeholder welfare. So Lizette mentioned a little bit about measurement of social value. And from my perspective as a finance professor, I think very often when you think about corporate managers or when you think about investors' perspective, what people want is a clear and unified targets. So if I invest, I know that my purpose is to maximize financial return, and this is straightforward, it's easy to understand. If you tell the manager, tell the investors that you not only should maximize your financial return, but you should also care about the welfare of stakeholders, then the investors and managers, they are confused, right? So it's easy to say that we care about social, but it's difficult to implement, especially when the investors and managers still have the financial return in mind. So as someone mentioned earlier, it's not entirely financial PE, so it's impact investing. We care about return as well as social impact. So one research we have been doing, it's an industry-oriented research at the Singapore Green Finance Center, is to quantify and monetize social impact, of course, as well as environmental impact. By saying monetizing, we try to convert those vaguely defined social values into quantifiable units and express them in monetary units. In such a way, my hope is that when you present this to an investor, this is the project, this is based on certain models and the calculations, you have this much financial impact that you are going to create, and that's what investors care anyway. And you also have this much social impact, which is also expressed in monetary terms, such that you can directly compare with the financial impact. Then investors sort of compare apple with apple and have a common unit, and the hope is to facilitate better decision making. So I think I can talk more later on about monetization of environmental social impact. But I think this is one aspect I want to pick up from the earlier presentation in terms of measurement.
How that's absolutely fascinating. And so personally, it's the key issue for me. I mean, when I'm appraising potential new additions to my fund, do I if I have a socially responsible investment and perhaps a less responsible investment, what is the difference in the metrics? And indeed, are the two comparable? I mean, are there any lessons from other areas of from private equity, from the listed markets that help us to put these two investments side by side?
Yeah, so I think many impact investors around the world, they are increasingly focusing on measuring impact, which is a big part of impact investing. And a lot of impact measurement frameworks have been proposed. I think the tricky thing is precisely because we have so many frameworks. During the presentation, I saw IRES Plus, I saw many other frameworks. So different frameworks have their own ingredients, have their own models, and they have different focus. So I think that's pose another challenge to decision makers. So I think one insight I can get from talking to practitioners, impact investors, is to think about impact measurement as something more transparent and more comparable. And we have a lot of agreement on E, on the environmental part. We know roughly how much we can value the carbon emission because there are carbon trading markets out there. There are carbon tax. Mm-hmm. So governments and the markets, they do try to put a dollar value or euro value into the environmental impacts. Whereas for social impacts, I think we need more of research, rigorous research in terms of, for example, how you think about the value of breaching human rights. How do you think about the value of improving people's welfare? So I think this is the insight I can offer from impact investing work.
Yeah, I mean, I know I'm deviating from the list of questions that we agreed ahead, but this is absolutely fascinating. Perhaps, perhaps for me particularly as an investor. But how do you deal with, or how have others dealt with the fact that, let's take human rights, that an individual investor may, or different groups of investors may apply different values to to individual social contributions. I'll give you an example. There was an investor who underwrote the fund that I run very recently, who underwrote us on our ESG capabilities before they even looked at our investment capabilities. So they're clearly signaling a set of priorities and therefore a sort of a value scheme where that investor is probably more willing to sacrifice return to achieve a set of social objectives than perhaps other investors that I have. So how do I deal with that? How do I deal with that as an investor? How are others dealing with that?
Let me be transparent upfront that this is a new field. Investing, impact management itself is a new field. A lot of things are going on. We are still trying to figure out, what is a better way to approach to quantify impact management. So I fully agree with you. It's challenging. Different people have different utility functions. Different people, they have different non-financial utilities in terms of how much financial return they want to sacrifice in order to get more social impact. So this is difficult, and we are well aware of this when we develop our framework. We call it impact-weighted account framework. So it needs to be combined with some social norm or cultural factors. So thinking about the investor from Singapore who may place a totally different weightage on the social impact compared to an investor from UK, of course. But on the other hand, you can also tie this with culture dimensions. And, I think in academic research, people also try to quantify culture through surveys, through, ratings. I did my PhD in the Netherlands, and there's a famous sociologist, Hofstede, who actually quantified culture around the world. And, I think these are the approaches that you can modify people's non-financial utility. But again, this is not perfect. So I want to be transparent.
Absolutely fascinating. So Louise, Colette, do you want to come in on this before we shift topics a bit?
Oh, I think Hal's covered it quite well, actually.
Okay, well, Louise, perhaps one a slightly different sort of tack. I mean, have you, in your reading and your work in this area, have you noticed any sort of almost acceleration of this as an issue as a result of COVID? Has working from home changed?
It's not necessarily the working from home. I think the whole point of the impact of COVID has escalated so many different trains of thought. I appreciate that legislation is different in all the regions that we're covering with the contributions today and the people who are joining this seminar. I'll give you an example of the UK. The Social Value Act was passed by Parliament in 2012, 10 years ago, primarily for the public sector, but it was slow to get traction. COVID, like the impact of COVID, has escalated the understanding of social value, the way that investors, as you've just been talking about, have embraced it, and why it's now becoming such an important element moving forward. I think COVID has helped escalate it. That's one positive from COVID. But there are a number of other elements that have all come to be like a perfect storm, if you like. I don't think the UK is alone in trying to spread out the jam, as we like to think of it, in terms of levelling up. COVID has helped escalate that approach. there's a lot of criticism in the way that the government in the UK is actually doing that, because there's an awful lot of rhetoric and not a lot of action. But there is, and it's picking up something that Lisette said in her presentation, there is this global or national versus local approach to social value. And I think that is has been escalated by COVID. So it's, I think people are taking it more seriously, whether or not that's because they've had time to think about it. Companies, particularly across the real estate, have had to review how they operate, which means that they absolutely have to look at how they treat their people. And social value does come into that. It's how they operate, where they operate, and given the skill shortage, they've got to retain good staff and attract new staff in. Social value plays a part in that and the way that the real estate industry works. So I think it's been an agitator, but from a positive point of view, COVID-19, and that's not even picking up on the things of you know, like COP26, which came in the middle, well, not in the middle of it, but basically there's so many elements to do with climate change, route to zero, decarbonisation, ESG. They've all combined in one big lump, if you like, and companies have, real estate companies have got to take it seriously. So I think it's concentrated minds. I'd say that it's been a positive because it's concentrated minds.
I think one of the things certainly we're seeing in our portfolio is that we're seeing certainly in the office sector, businesses working harder to try and encourage people to come back to the office. They're explicitly recognizing a productivity gain of people working closely together, and ESG is part of that. Companies now recognize that they have to offer offices, and I think that have the characteristics that are going to encourage people to want to work in them. And that's a change, and that's been accelerated by technology, by this technology, and by other things.
And it's also highlighted the issue of the issue of mental health.
Yeah, absolutely.
The S really, we've not picked up on it as much on the mental health side of things, but absolutely critical going forward. 10 years ago, when I was putting together the Inclusive Employers Quality Mark for the RICS, mental health was never mentioned. That's only 10 years ago. It wasn't part of that strategy. Now it would head up any strategy. That's the sea change, and COVID-19 has definitely helped that.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Colette, one of the things I said at the beginning was that we approach this topic from a range of different perspectives on this panel. Could you just talk to how you see the focus on S differing when you're looking at it from an investment perspective, an occupier perspective, or how do you see those differences playing out?
Yeah, it probably would be a good example. I don't know, Paul, if you have that chart that I sent you, but we could probably talk about it from that perspective as well, from the asset. I would certainly hope that this would be aligned, right, from the asset level all the way up to the corporate level, and hopefully that'll improve over time. So let me give you an example. Tenants or occupiers look for space based on talent availability as one criteria. And developers have a role to play in helping create communities that attract, in addition to supporting that talent. And it's also true of building management. So if you think about just this chart, I know it's a bit of an eye chart, but in essence, when you're looking at social as part of that ESG, one example of that would be diversity, labor relations, but also when we're managing the facility, taking a look at utilizing local vendors and having fair wage requirements within our contracts. And that can benefit the owner, it can benefit the occupier, as well as the community. So I want to at least preface that there is a difference between the S of social value and ESG. And Lisette said it earlier, right? So, social value is about the value that is created for society. And ESG, which has historically been steeped in kind of risk mitigation. And Paul, you mentioned it, right? Investors really looking at these three categories. And what you see in the light blue, those are somewhat general kind of common categories, either through the ESG assessments, in addition to standard accounting boards and others. So if you take those common categories, they each correlate to some type of real estate initiative that can be performed by a corporation, a user, et cetera. So really remaining focused on those areas. But what's interesting here is there was some discussion around building certification, right? Whether it's LEED, WELL, or GRESB. And those are either used as frameworks or benchmarks by both owners and investors. And building certification is a consideration for some occupants, and it does focus on health, whether it's lighting or indoor air quality, but it's only a sliver of what S really encompasses. And thinking about it more broadly, and I'm sure hopefully in the next year or two, we'll be having the same discussion around the G. But there has to be, when we look at the business case, right, we've tended historically as an industry to focus on E, because we understand the payback period associated with a reduction of consumption in some of these areas. We're now looking at S, which is a longer period of time. And how do we balance that over the full life of an asset? And having to do that from the development at the beginning all the way through to the exit or reuse of that facility. And really understanding it when you look at the age and the amount of the building stock that we do have that already exists, right? Not just existing new buildings. And I just want to go back and leave you, there was an interesting, looking at the ULI study that was done and shared earlier, it noted that 1/3 of the respondents, referred to SDGs in kind of how they look at approaching this, but then also over a quarter developed kind of their own bespoke model. And it's interesting because of that bespoke model and how they're looking at shared value, it's interesting that the developers, designers, investors, asset owners were more likely to use that bespoke model. But it'd be interesting to see how many of them actually believe that their bespoke model creates a competitive advantage. And I think that goes to the business case and looking at it more long-term and having more stakeholders develop that business case and share in that responsibility of the business case.
Yeah, no, fascinating. I mean, I think we're let me just maximize that again. Yeah, I mean, a lot of fascinating issues. I mean, the issues of measurement, the issues of having different measurement approaches, and having people like me perhaps the ability to arbitrage different approaches to get whatever goal I want to present to my investors is something that whether there's opacity as to what method one should follow, there's obviously the scope to game those approaches. How, just sort of coming back to measurement, perhaps diving a little bit more deeply, into this. I mean, how we talked a bit before about some of the higher level challenges, but could you dig into some of the alternate approaches that you see being adopted? The strengths and the weaknesses of them, and whether there are any sort of emerging areas of best practice that you see coming out of it from a broader perspective.
Okay, sure. I think so. First, from a researcher's perspective, actually we use similar inputs as investors. For investors, they look for ESG ratings of the assets they want to invest, but here ratings are mostly given to public equity, and for researchers, we want to evaluate the level of ESG or the change of ESG. We also look at the ratings. So this could be one alternative, but there are also a lot of challenges with those ESG ratings. There are too many ratings out there. You look at the same company or the same assets from different rating agencies, you get very different answer. So that has confusion. And the rating is usually a black box, so you don't know what actually goes into the rating, what's the machinery within the rating metrics. Although there are some efforts in standardizing those rating metrics, including the real estate sectors, for example, standards for green building, standards for other certifications, but still I think there's a certain degree of black box nature that we cannot get rid of. So I think this is one challenge with the rating that also limits its use. And with regard to the impact that we discussed, especially the social impacts, of course, we talk about some high-level challenges. Different people have different views, different utilities about certain impact. I think another technical challenge would be how we think about direct versus indirect impacts. Okay, so I try to use real estate examples. If you think about direct impacts, I built affordable housing. So, I help people so people can now more easily live in the house. And so this is direct impacts. Indirect impacts would be the savings they have from house purchase. Now they can do other things, right? They send their kids to better school, receive better education, and increase their lifelong earnings. These are something that we don't measure. But this happens, and it's challenging to measure them because they are indirect. And this is the indirect in the occupants. You can also have indirect impacts in, the real estate companies per se, because it has its own value chain. So the fact that you build in certain ways will affect your suppliers as well. So, and we cannot measure that. So when you think about E, it's relatively easy to measure. We have, so-called scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. Scope 3 is about your value chain emission. But I think we don't have an agreement on scope 3 for the social dimension. So real estate is one example, but we can think about all sectors having this example. So this is another challenge. One more challenge I can think of is what I, as a researcher, I call counterfactual. So that means, when we measure impacts, we need to compare with a benchmark, with a reference scenario. So you can have two types of impact measurement. One is, without my investment or without my intervention, this is the impact relative to a zero scenario. That means no investment, no intervention at all. So this is more like absolute impact. However, without my investment, a more likely case will be someone else will invest. Another bank will provide a loan for the building essential. So the impact that I create should be compared with the reference scenario rather than with the zero scenario, right? However, the reference scenario varies depending on what is your reference point, what is your benchmark. And again, this is relatively subjective. So different people may have different reference scenarios in mind.
It's fascinating. Would it be correct to characterize, so take my role as a fund manager, my clients have ESG goals. Would it be correct to say that I have sufficient flexibility at the moment to be able to characterize what I'm doing in such a way that I'm always doing a good job? Have I got the flexibility to say, I'm doing a great job on the S and ESG because I'm telling you, because that's how I'm measuring it. Is it that much of the Wild West at the moment? And if so, how do we then give me less flexibility, give me less degrees of freedom to manipulate the story to serve my commercial interests?
Yeah, so I think to a large extent, yes, to your answer, unfortunately, but I think that is also a common problem. I mean, as you mentioned, you are a fund manager, and I think a big issue in the financial world is I present my investment product to my clients, and I can always be flexible in choosing my benchmark.
Well, that's true, but IRR is IRR, right? We have made progress. I mean, Lizette was formerly with INREV. We've now got a great benchmark for open-ended funds across Europe. But so we do have credible benchmarks for returns. Therefore, I've got less flexibility in how I manipulate my multiple and my IRR to present the best story. But I've got far more degrees of freedom on ESG. I've got far more degrees of freedom on the E element, and I've got even more on the S element. So that raises a very interesting question: is how do we create an environment to make me behave?
Precisely. I think you made a good point about IRR, which is more like an absolute measure. absolute performance measure, whereas, comparing with your benchmark, like what most mutual funds are doing is, a relative performance measure. So I think one way to reduce this flexibility, or, if you like, you can use the word greenwashing. If you have the flexibility to choose your benchmark, you can greenwash. I don't know what was the S version of greenwashing. Greenwashing sounds like E, I mean, so that's why we need more transparency and we need more common units. So this is the reason that I mentioned earlier that we are trying to monetize social impacts. We also want to have a relatively absolute measure, sort of the IRR for your social investment, for your social impact. But again, this is challenging. And I think another important point is that since you mentioned, you are presenting this to your clients, and your clients, of course, have their own social value. So I think an important way is to, let the clients define what is the right benchmark, what is the reference scenario. And then, of course, this needs a lot of education on the client side.
Absolutely. I mean, thank you, Hal. That's fascinating. Louise, do you want to?
Yeah, I've got a couple of points on this. There's a lot of movement in trying to communalize, if you like, get a standard approach to this. The Social Value Portal, which is a really well-respected organisation in the UK, particularly that has embraced the real estate sector, their TOMs, their themes of measurement, are generally taken up by the industry. But even when they are taken up, they are interpreted in different ways. I'd like, if I may, just take this discussion just to bring in two examples. One is a developer, Landsec, and the other one is the Land Trust. Now, just to some headline figures, whether or not it's greenwashing or social value washing, who knows? But Landsec brought in and developed a bespoke social value programme and calculated in their own way 3.2 million sterling of social value created in 1 year. That increased to 4.8 million. So it's being increased. Now they've calculated that by putting a figure next to the work that they're doing with charity partners, volunteer hours from their staff, how many students they bring on board, have engagement days. So there are certain ways that they calculate it. I'm going to turn, if I may, and in a way it would have been, I've got some wonderful slides, but we didn't have the time to be able to upload all the slides. I'm going to give the example of the Land Trust, which is a charity. Now, they have embraced social value and environmental value hugely. For those that don't know the Land Trust, it's a UK-based body, was a government quango, is now independent with charity status. Basically, it funds, develops and manages open space, lakes, wetlands, parks, from rivers to wildflower meadows. Huge parts of the UK are managed by the Land Trust. Right, so that sets the scene. It's got a charitable objectives, it's got charitable status, and so there's lots of ways that the operation can be measured as with charitable objectives. So gross value, GVA, and fiscal savings when they operate, and then the wider economic or social value, which is quite tricky. But what the Land Trust has done is they've looked at one of their biggest developments, which is at Bewley in Essex, which is a 20-year build-out, massive development, nearly 4,000 new homes across over 600 acres of land, where there's a massive green space program. Let's call it that. That's, people can imagine what it is. So wildflower meadows, walkways, landscaping within the development, landscape around the development, infrastructure, sud schemes, you name it, it's there. And it's been used as a really good example of how to value what's of value, what can be measured that can then be presented as social value. So some of those criteria have included, again, I'm reading from this, the slide I've got in front of me. So healthcare costs saved by people using open space, and then that having a massive impact on their mental health, and them not needing to go to the local doctor's surgery to be put on antidepressants. adults engaged in some of the maintenance and some of the training, the school visits, the school interaction. So lists, I've got a great table here, and there have been figures put down there of what care we've liaised with the Health Trust. What saving have they seen? And there's a figure that we can put down there. How many people have been involved in the landscaping programs and some of the outdoor activities? So how many hours have we interacted with schools? And we've been able to put figures down because those are the themes of measurement which we feel as the land trust feels is important to monetize. And it's phenomenal the amount of value you can attribute to just that activity. So back to your question of what's the challenges of measurement, it's while you can set themes of measurement and you can set some straightforward benchmarks, it will always be, if you like, in the eye of the beholder. Some people will view it in certain ways and other people will view it in different ways.
Well, it's value for whom, isn't it? I mean, should Landsec be only focused on the value that's attributed to their
absolutely
to their shareholders?
But it's good greenwash, isn't it? It's good PR. Now that can impact on investment. It can tick a little box in some investors' spreadsheet, and Bob's your uncle. Whereas, but then
that's the matter for some investors more than for other investors. Yes. That brings us back to the point we were talking. So I mean, it's an issue that's fascinating for me, and perhaps brings me to my next question, which Colette. I mean, we seem to be debating on one side, real estate is always a financial asset, and that it's IRR, it's multiple, it's the pound in our pocket, the dollar in our pocket. And then on the other side, it's something we're doing for more altruistic reasons to benefit the wider society. How do we bring those two together? I mean, should we be, is there any reason of thinking that we view real estate as a financial asset, real estate as a social asset, or is it inevitably some sort of amalgam between the two?
It's a great question. I would say it's both, right? So it's no secret, and I think it was mentioned earlier at the beginning of the start today that we've tended as an industry to view the feasibility of projects and investment decisions towards a slant towards financial returns, right? But we're also looking at social value creation as kind of this added benefit historically. And it's interesting because buildings at its roots, they serve the people that are occupying and society in general, right? So they're here to serve society. And we shouldn't view assets just from that perspective of profit without regards to the impact to people or location, right? Location for real estate. But also how that real estate is actually attracting individuals to that space, but also looking at it longer term. They have to come together for a longer term view of real estate assets. And that's longer sometimes, that business case, than the hold period of someone in a particular moment in time for that particular asset. And, there was some discussion earlier about how do we measure this? And, it's similar to the argument that we had years ago around, healthy buildings. And we have certification around that for healthy buildings, but we don't have any certification around for the value created or the social value for the building. And I don't know if that falls within the certification or that's going to fall within the regulatory, but there's certainly an opportunity to look and rate a building just as we do energy, right? You get an energy score for a building as well in certain parts of the globe. I'm sorry, Paul, you were going to say something?
No, it's something that's absolutely fascinating. When we talk about, healthy buildings, when we talk about, environmental certification, so there is evidence that proves that buildings that are better in an environmental sense deliver more robust cash flows. So maybe,
and productivity of the occupants in some cases.
Maybe they may be more bond-like. They may be less prone to obsolescence. So maybe is there almost a circularity which says that if I, as an investor, focus on buildings that deliver this social value, that deliver, you know, better environmental characteristics, better social characteristics, that give something back to the community, that I'm actually acquiring a building that will give me a more solid income stream, a more reliable income stream, an income stream that will lease up more rapidly, etc. So is there possibly a feedback to my pure capitalist objective of getting the best return for my investors and giving the best exposure to my investors?
You know, I think you're similar. I'll go back to the ULI study, right, that we talked about earlier. And in that same study, they talked about 80% of the folks that were surveyed believe that monetizing social value is important, yet only 22% of those actually took that approach. So it is interesting, you know, how do we solve for this, and how do we solve for it collectively together, having the developer at the table, you know, the occupant, the manager of that space, the government or public entity, all sitting at the table looking at this as a solution long term, in how to calculate that social value or contribute to that social value in the long term.
No, it's absolutely fascinating. Just bringing this together, I was conscious of time. We thought at the beginning that we wouldn't be able to fill 50 minutes, but there's so much to talk about here that I think we could have done double. But we talked at the beginning about collaboration. It came up in Lizette's comments as well. Where are the areas of low-hanging fruit? You know, how can the real estate industry collaborate better with itself? How can it collaborate with other actors in a better way? What are the areas that, you know, that we can do a better job of together in order to move this forward? Again, you know, ladies first. Maybe Colette first.
Yeah, you know, I go to the same challenge even in the management of the space, right? When we get the pass over from the developer and we're managing it, and we have certain materials that are used, and how do we clean and maintain that? So that collaboration, while it's sticky sometimes even today, there is that dialogue of how do you bring people together and have a seat at the table to solve for this? And frankly, I think we need academics that are going to help us solve for this when we talk about that monetization. I think events like this bring it to the forefront, right? There are a lot of brighter minds on this call today than myself that are going to help solve this in the future.
We're all brighter together. Louise.
I think it's a perennial question. Whenever we get to a sticky issue like this, the logical thing is to get all the wonderful institutions around the table, and we're all talking together and holding hands and giving each other hugs. And everybody knows in practice, it never blinking happens, does it? Let's be honest. And I think that it's a bit like imposing regulations and guidance and all the rest of it. My feeling is the market will actually lead the way here. I think that it will be the market that decides what is important and what isn't important. We can all pontificate in our little ivory towers and say, well, I think that this should be a theme of measurement and this should be our bottom line. We will never agree, but there will be some core directions of travel. Lisette right at the beginning outlined the work that the ULI have done, which is really strong, really good. You know, wearing my historic RICS hat on, you know, I know in the past, let's put it that way, the RICS has done some great work on this. It needs to get its act together and start moving forward. It will do. The RTPI, again, from a land use planning and design point of view, is, you know, has got some fantastic pieces of research. It's so difficult to get all of that in one place, so we're all looking at it the same way. I'd like to think we could, and it doesn't stop collaboration by any stretch of the imagination, but something is going to have to lead this. And in my experience, it's going to be the market that leads it.
I agree. How just bring this home?
Yeah, very briefly, I think, you know, being an academic situated in Asia, who is not from a real estate background, I think this is the type of collaboration we want to have, right? So it's a great opportunity that, you have people from different geographies, from industry and academics, as Colette just mentioned, and you need, different perspectives from real estate and from the ESG side. So I think this is a great event which actually check all these 3 boxes.
No, I couldn't agree more. I agree with Louise. I mean, it's it's the market that's going to do what it's done for other elements of reporting on returns, reporting on the E element of ESG. And it's going to do exactly the same thing.
I'll give you a really good example of that. A great example of that is, and I'm sure it's the same in other parts of the world. In the UK, every business has got to declare its position on gender balance and gender pay.
Yeah.
Okay. The way that has been imposed is a complete farce, because it's just statistics and you can make the statistics read whatever you want. The actual rationale behind it, in a way, has been lost, because businesses just think of it now as a box ticking exercise to a degree. But there is an instinct to get it right. Those companies that are trying to tick all the boxes are, in a way, there's some resentment. But it's the underlying direction of travel which I think will carry more weight. And I think that will be the same on social value.
I couldn't agree more. I'll end with one sort of anecdote from my practice. There was a European investment fund that issued an RFP. This was last year, and it had a major section at the end on ESG. And we found out at the end of the process, which we were successful on, that the ESG section was a trap. What they did was that they expected your approach to ESG, all elements of it, to pervade your entire submission. And that if you did anything other than just simply refer back to sections 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10 in the ESG section, you got it wrong. So they were looking for groups that where these sort of questions pervade how we buy buildings, how we manage buildings, how we define strategy, and where it's not an add-on, it's not something that can be greenwashed, because it's in every part of your process. So, Steve, we've taken a bit more of our time, but it was a fascinating discussion. I'd like to thank the panel members and also you for the opportunity to do this. Very, very interesting.
Well, I echo your thanks. Paul, thank you to you yourself for some very competent leadership of the panel. And thanks to Lou and Colette, and how I could have, we're going to a break now, but I could have listened for another 30 minutes to you all. I love the bit, Lou, where you said there was a measurement where people can go out and enjoy green space and not go to their doctors for antidepressants. That's the holy grail, measuring that, the value, creating and measuring that value. So you all made wonderful points from some really great experience, and how, thanks for being the research person. We need that collaboration between the research piece and the practitioner piece as well. Okay, we're going to go to a break. We're